hope I'm in focus. I think I am. I have a new setup. I am currently redoing my apartment, and if you're interested, there will be a couple of videos going up. I think I'm gonna do one where I redo the space. So I'm doing one room at a time. Currently, I'm like almost there with the living room. I still don't have my sofa, but I'm in the middle of the living room, and once this is done, I'll do like a living room tour, and then I'll tackle the kitchen, and then I'm gonna redo my office space, and then the bedroom, and then the corridor area too. So slowly I'm going through a kind of home, not a renovation, but just like an interior switch. I feel like the last time I bought stuff was when I moved into this house and I didn't have a lot of, expendable income back then, and I just kind of picked stuff that I could afford and still suited my style, whereas right now it's a lot easier for me to kind of be like, I like a lot of stuff, doesn't mean I should put everything in my house. So I'm kind of dialing it down and making a much more me space. So a little bit of a sidetrack. Today we're talking about a book called Love in the Big City by Sang Young Park, and I just thought I would pick a pretty little space to talk to you guys in. And this is by Anton Her. I think I've talked about this publishing house before. That's their logo. It's called Tilted Axis. And I found it quite easy. Like, I'm always looking for a lot of translated fiction, international literature, and it's not the easiest to find them because you usually have like, I don't know, every month 5-6 books that are in circulation that everyone's raving about. But in order to find those like a little bit more niche works, I feel like this is a good place to look for them. Apart from certain influencers who actually specialize in talking about translated fiction, which I think is also a great way to find new books. I love the cover, and this is translated by Anton Her, who also translated another book I recently read, which is I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki. Excellent book, review coming soon. I love the cover because of how well it, oh, am I doing this? Okay, I love the cover because how well it represents the friendship that is at the center of this book. And it's a friendship between a girl called Jae-hee and Young, I think is the name. I don't know if it is based a little bit of a like a semi-autobiographical book, but yeah, someone told me that this is like a kind of queer romance book, and it made me, I wasn't just sure that I would love that because I don't love romance, but after I read it, it's actually not. It follows Young's life through 4 stages. The first stage being his friendship with Jae-hee, and she's like this, girl going through like, not coming of age, but more like, early 20s, and she's trying to find her way in life, and it's kind of like her gay best friend and their relationship and them living together and how that sits within the backdrop of Korean society. So you get to experience Jae-hee's kind of life as a young woman in her 20s in South Korea and how that plays for her, and at the same time you get the parallel between her life and her best friend's life, who is a young queer man in Seoul, and they both live there, and Seoul is one of the most progressive places in Korea, so it's like kind of an interesting take on what is the current society in Seoul like and how they treat young people there. At the start of the book, you kind of, you're in this setting where Young is attending Jae-hee's wedding, so this is in the future. And as he's sitting there around people he maybe knew in the past, maybe they're just Jae-hee's friends, it's just people in a completely different stage of life, and he's reminiscing about those days in their early 20s. This book, mostly it goes through all of his 20s, like 20s and 30s, but he's now reminiscing, going back to his early 20s. He met Jae-hee when they were really young in the parking of like Hamilton Hotel, which is like in the Itaewon area, and they met there, and she came up to him and said something really funny, so they hit it off immediately. They got to know each other really well. They started living together, and he would be kind of dating around, and she would always have these really funny remarks about people he's dating, or he would even get into pretty dangerous situations every now and then with his romantic interests. So it's like, it's almost written in a very nonchalant, very light-hearted tone, but it's not that light-hearted, because when you really kind of peel the layers back and you take a step back and you're kind of thinking about what would it have felt like at the time when they were experiencing this, you can say that this is a little bit out of date and not fully representative of current society, because the person is going back in time, like he is recalling memories from earlier in his life, more than a decade ago. So that's a long time to have passed, and I kind of take back on the fact that I was talking about like present day soul, but more so I think how over generations and over time what stereotypes have been built in society, and how both of them have kind of tried to overcome that and just make their own identity and find out who they are, and also cope with the whole idea of like there's so many expectations put on you and you're actually really struggling where everyone else seems to like going ahead and doing really well, and you're still stuck in that same cycle of like wanting the same things, like basic things. You just want a good partner and you just want to, make enough money to go by, and even those things are not going too well, then how can you really focus on anything else? I feel like the best part about the book was that the characters don't take themselves too seriously, and they made me enjoy the book even more. There is a part, so I think the third part of the story, the book, is about Young's relationship with his mother and how him being queer affected that. And it is actually, I think, the most, I don't know, like painful part to read and go through, because his mom is going through an illness. She is battling, I think it was cancer. I'm pretty sure it was cancer. And in this setting, like he feels so much guilt for so many things, but at the same time, he doesn't go too deep into it. It kind of like reinforces the fact that there's so much you have to go through all the time, but you kind of just learn to go on and move on with life, because what can you do? And I think that theme came up again and again, that like shit will happen all the time. Many times in stories they kind of go like this arch, like, oh, like you're in this good part of your life, then you have a dip and you go back up. Sometimes it's not really like that. Sometimes it's just average all the way through, and I would like to see more representation and stories of people who don't have these highs and lows. And although that's normal too, but I feel like sometimes you don't have these like magical big moments all the time. You don't have these extreme lows, but you're just like kind of cruising through. And that's what most people are doing. So why don't we hear more stories about that? Maybe it's not as interesting. To me, it is. Another part of the book that I really found interesting was how much the type of relationships or the dynamic of the main character and his love interest change over time. So early on he has these really like toxic relationships, but over time you see him meeting people and getting into more serious relationships, and even the dynamic changes. And then even his relationship with Jaehee changes over time. So I think it's like more like kind of reinforcing the fact that it's very natural to drift away from people who you once like, you lived with them, you knew everything about them, and suddenly you find yourself in a space where you know nothing about them. They feel like complete strangers, and it's like it happens more than we realize, and it's always so painful to think about, like, oh my god, like we were such good friends, what happened? That's not just you or me feeling like that. Most of us go through that change in our 20s. And the second part being, we also learn a lot, even though we're not realizing that we're learning a lot, but our past experiences, as we go through time, as we get into new relationships, we do carry some part of the previous relationship with us, and we try to do things better. And I think he himself was not very reflective of that, but as he was narrating experiences or like situations in his relationships, you could see that character development or growth within him. I think it was the third or fourth part of the book where he started talking about an STI that he had, and this part of the book was the most heartbreaking for me personally, because you could learn, like you could really relate to him in the fact that how much it affected in his life and how much it isolated him. So various things happen in our life, we might be going through I don't know, like we might be going through a really bad breakup, or your parents might be getting divorced, and so many horrible things can happen to people in their life. And sometimes that really isolates you because you don't really know how to deal with it yourself. You might be battling some kind of chronic illness, and in his case it was an STI. He felt that isolation so deeply, but the way he reacted to it was just so fully. It didn't feel like he was trying to push it down and just like, push it aside and not deal with it, but more so in that like didn't take it like too seriously, but he knew, like you could still see how much it affected him, but he wasn't like, this happened and my life is over. He still had that same attitude he had when he was earlier, like younger in his life, where he's just like, okay, this happened, what can I do? Like if things are beyond your control, there is really nothing you can do. And I think sometimes we struggle to accept the fact that there is nothing we can do. The only thing we can do is like make the most of what we do have and just move on. But that move on aspect is the hardest. And I almost wish like the author went a little bit deeper into that whole aspect of how he was dealing with it mentally, like how he was justifying all of these things happening to him. I think it's a really good portrayal in general, the book, about how in our youth we often feel like this, like a lot of emptiness, be that in a romantic sense or be that in like fulfillment, career. We tend to fill this gap with a lot of distractions all the time, and that's what it is. People can say, oh, young people are so all over the place, they're constantly doing all this shit and like they getting into drugs and getting into this and that, and I think you forget sometimes like how it is to be in that age, how much of it is just so hard to deal with when you don't have any control, when you can't do anything about your situation. You do need some things to just take the edge off, and I'm not saying those things are good. I'm just saying there is always a reason why through generations people have resorted to either, you know, getting into toxic romantic relationships or the other to battle just societal issues, because if there was more, I don't know, opportunities for young people to really establish themselves younger or have a more stable life younger, then maybe it wouldn't have gone to that extent, but it's really hard. In terms of the author himself, something that I would love to see more of is the type of characters he writes, because not every character needs to have a positive character arc, right? Not everybody's life goes, like I said before, like up and down. I think talking about growth and change in people and how the characters change, that's important, but at the same time, some people do stay the same. After 20 years, 30 years, they don't suddenly start having like all the motivation in the world to do something. They don't suddenly, you know, they're like people who are quite satisfied, and then you meet them 5 years later, they're still quite satisfied. They've not suddenly become like, I'm gonna be the next millionaire entrepreneur. So I think that's also something that's quite important to portray in literature or books or movies or wherever it is. Just to talk about, like, even if we want to crave growth in ourselves, it's important to not force that idea onto someone else that you also need to grow, you also need to improve all the time. It's good, don't get me wrong, but I think it's also something that is quite situational and circumstances matter. I think this is something I learned much later in my 20s than my early 20s. Early 20s I was more like, you know, we all have more of the mindset that we can all kind of push ourselves a little bit more. But as life has got more difficult and I've had to deal with more shit, and I realized that even though I am someone who does feel a lot of pressure myself to constantly grow and change and develop myself, sometimes you just can't, because it's like life gets to shit, and that's what it is. Wrapping my thoughts up on the book, I think I would have enjoyed if the whole book was just centered around Jae-hee and Young's friendship rather than it going on a different tangent. Okay, it does give you different aspects of a person's life and talks a lot more in depth about how it is, you know, through different stages of life growing up in Korea, South Korea. But I think the first part was the most enjoyable for me, and if it fleshes it out and writes more about it, I'd be more than interested to read. Tara Boy is here. Hi. Hi. Hi, baby. Hi, were you sleeping? Wanna say hi? Hi, everyone. Hi. Good boy. Good boy. You wanna sit down with Mama as she finishes? I'm almost done, so Taro can stay here with us. He can chill with us. What was I saying? Yeah, so that's my take on the book. I hope it was interesting. I personally would love to read more from this author, but I think I would love to read more of like Young's character and Jae-hee's character than the other characters. Like some of the love interests were really not interesting at all. And then whoever did this cover for them, like, really good. So yeah, that's all for today, and I hope you enjoyed the review, and I'll see you soon.